Dr. Nicholas Perna, as we are together today to talk about the nose, it only feels right to ask you if you could smell only one thing for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Oh my goodness. That boy, that I was not prepared for that one at all. That's nice and off the cuff. I think I might say, I don't know, my wife's perfume, would probably be my first thing that comes to mind.
Oh, that's nice. What a romantic.
After that, maybe tikka masala.
Ah, okay. I don't want to know what your wife's perfumes are.
Well, no, I'm just thinking after that, like a something of my culinary interests. But
Yeah,
yeah,
can't beat a good tikka masala.
hmm
Well,
indeed.
Dr. Nicholas Perna, it's a great pleasure to have you on the podcast, and I promise I've got more intelligent questions coming up.
I hope not. I liked those two to start. It's great.
What struck your interest in the nose to start with? Why did this research come up for you?
Yeah, when I was in graduate school, one of my graduate degrees, the teacher I was working with at the time felt, despite my early career successes that I was having, I was already working at that point as a singer, felt that I was singing in their vocabulary straight out my nose, that I was singing with in what they would have considered to be too much nasality. And I didn't necessarily agree with that at the time. And actually, I would probably say still, I don't agree with their assessment of how I was singing at that time. That period of time in my singing career led me into some difficulty singing in general. After having kind of a rise up career going very fast, 1,000 miles an hour, it kind of crashed at the same speed. And that got me into teaching. It got me into research. Admittedly, I think, like many of us, perhaps who end up having an interest in voice pedagogy, voice science, etc., I wanted to know what was wrong with me, kind of selfishly, right? And I also wanted to understand why my at that point, previous teacher had thought I sang so nasal. And I wanted to understand that. And that led me into what became my dissertation research, which was my first project on nasality, which was specifically only looking at operatic tenor singing and nasality. Um, I'll use still nasality as a general word there, but that's the basic story of how it got started.
When we're considering the nose and its involvement in singing, if we take a look at the anatomy for a second, even though we know that when we change one thing in the system, we tend to change the whole thing,
Correct.
what sort of structural building blocks or features or nearby anatomical landmarks would be useful for us to familiarize ourselves with when we're talking about the nose?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Though, I mean, the obviously the most important physiologic aspect would be the velum or velum itself, which we generically, of course, call the soft palate. And I think more importantly, the consideration is the opening of the port to your nose, which is often called the velopharyngeal port or the velopharyngeal opening. That really is what matters. The percentage to which the velopharyngeal port is open or closed, the movement of the velum itself, that whether that opening is fully closed, partially closed, not at all closed. Um, those tend to be the things directly related, but I also want to point out a few other anatomical structures that I think are very important for us in this conversation because they matter perceptually. And that is the piriform sinuses, which are kind of the two little gutters at the bottom of the larynx, like below the vocal folds. Basically, just little holes that, in case food or water spills down towards your vocal folds, past your epiglottis by accident usually, those piriform sinuses will be used to filter that debris into your esophagus rather than you're letting it go down your trachea, rather than passing through the vocal folds and, potentially choking you. The piriform sinuses matter, and what matters about them are the structures that can cover the piriform sinuses, those being the back pharyngeal wall, thanks to muscle activation of constrictor muscles, also the tongue root, which can reverse and do some posterior narrowing of the pharynx. But what matters about those structures is how they're covering the piriforms or not. And I think those are probably the overarching most important anatomical structures. Although I would add one other thing. I also think it's important for us to note the function of the soft palate. Like what is its role? Because most of our singing structures, right? Larynx, tongue, jaw, whatever, their primary function is to help us eat and drink, right? Like survival is our first function. Singing is our not our first function. And I think it's important for us to realize that the soft palate has an important function, that it covers up the nasal passage, the velopharyngeal port, when we eat and drink. And if you're familiar with how chewing and swallowing work, it's also important for us to remember that when we swallow, and you can just put your finger on your larynx and swallow, and your larynx pops right up. At the same time, your soft palate closes off. But as most singing teachers would recognize, whatever style of singing you're training, most singing styles don't want an overly raised larynx. Even if they want a larynx that can bob up and down and move freely and do some different things, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's important for us to realize that actually the natural action of the soft palate or the velum closing the velopharyngeal port is the action of swallowing, which is a high larynx. And so, like so many other things in singing, one of the things, if you're attempting to not sing with velopharyngeal opening, I think it's important to note that you're actually trying to overcome the natural inclination that a closed velopharyngeal port is a high larynx. Mm-hmm. So anyway, those are probably the anatomical things I would want to point out early on, just as part of this discussion, if that answers your question.
Yeah. And can we go into a little bit of the actual movement of the soft palate and what it does when it's closing and opening the port?
Yeah, I think the first thing, and I'll do this for your YouTube folks, I think first of all, we need to realize that from a body mapping standpoint, all of this is much more forward in our body than we think it is. Like, so often we think of, these structures as like the pharynx as like way back here or something like that. That's your spine. Mm-hmm. The pharynx is actually about right here just inside the masseter. And so if we think of then the nasopharynx being just slightly above that, and so the velopharyngeal port being slightly above that, the first thing I always like people to realize is it's much more anterior in your body than most of us think it is. The second thing I would say is the soft palate movement itself, and you can see this on any of the 3D MRI videos of singing on YouTube, what have you, whether it's Matthias Echternach's videos or the videos that Matt Edwards and Aaron Johnson did together, or pick your video. The movement is actually a posterior movement. It's not so much, the phrase always somehow translated to English of lift your soft palate. It's not so much an up movement as it is a back movement. And I think that is an important thing to consider. There's also the physiological movement of whether or not, when that movement happens and occurs, you can, even from a front to back motion, you can see on those MRI videos that it's not a perfectly uniform, it's either back or it's front. It moves around in most free singing. Also, we can't, from those images, confirm for certain whether or not the sides are fully closed, the middle's fully closed, maybe the center of it is slightly open while the sides are totally shut off. We can't really confirm that from those MRI images. And I don't remember exactly who it was that turned me on to that idea that we could have different configurations of the soft palate in terms of, you would almost call it like competence of closure, whether the soft palate is completely closing off the velopharyngeal port or not. But the movement generally is, it maybe is slightly up, but it's a back motion for the most part.
How much sensory awareness do we have of the soft palate? And in your experience, what is your description to when your soft palate is lowered and when your soft palate is raised or lifted or whatever terminology we're using?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It really gets us into some weeds with semantics because I think the answer is it's different for everybody. Like the difference of actual because all of our kinesthetic proprioception, all of our sensory feedbacks are different, and so there is no one observable sense that it feels like. So I think that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I would say about that question is I tend to not think about it. Kind of on purpose, not kind of on purpose. I don't think about it on purpose. In my teaching, I deal with it with students if and when I need to, like any other thing of singing, right? Kind of like don't fix it if it isn't broke. If I have someone who basically seems to be taking a moderately relaxed inhalation and it seems to be functioning well, I'm not going to address their breathing right away, right? It's the same thing with anything related to the velum or the soft palate or a nasal sound. I'm not going to deal with it unless I have to with a student. But to answer your question, in my own singing, I generally don't think about it much. I can do it. I can command it because I can make both the really dopey, dull sound or not, the sound or not. I can go to that extreme. It's like with anything with singing. It's easy to go to the extremes. It's hard to find the balanced middle thing, right? And so, I mean, now I've observed people who can make all kinds of dexterous movements with their velum that they've done through visual observation, like shining a light in their mouth and literally watching the velum move and such, because just like we all have different sensations of what things feel like, we all have different facility with our movements. We have more motility or less motility with all of our structures, and the velum is no different than that.
In your thoughts, then, when we consider physiology, and I know there's been reference studies to somebody like Dina Menzel and the size of her mouth and head in terms of belting, what does the size of the nose structure itself, or maybe the nostrils, say about singing? Is there a potential experience impact there?
I don't think we know. That's the honest answer, because I think okay, so here's what we do know. What we do know is what seems to matter in regards to the nose itself. What seems to matter is the percent or not of airflow / acoustic signal that passes through the nasal passage or not that has an impact on things. But regarding like the size, shape, etc. of an individual's nasal passage, we do not have good data on that to speak of. Particularly regarding like whether it makes them a greater chance at being a belter or an opera singer or a folk singer or whatever, or having a lower voice or a higher voice or a whatever voice. We do not have good data on that. Not that, well, I should say, not that I've seen.
And is that the same for things like deviated septums and things? We just don't know quite yet how that impacts.
Well, there's quite a lot of research on deviated septums. I mean, because that's a medical issue, and the medical field can afford a lot more research than we can. I mean, that's the golden age problem, right? I mean, the singing and speaking voice generally is not seen as, in both of our countries anyway, at least unless I'm unfamiliar with Great Britain more than I think I am. Neither of our countries recognize the singing voice as a public health concern, whereas a deviated septum is something that is a medical diagnosis. Therefore, we've actually got a larger body of research on it because the funding came from medicine, not from the arts or the even the sciences. Which has always been able to command more financial dollars for research. So, I mean, there are definitely studies you could read about the impact of a deviated septum, although those would not necessarily focus on what a deviated septum does to the singing voice. They would focus on how a deviated septum could affect your ability to chew food, swallow, be understood in speech maybe, but not sing your high C.
So into a little bit of the nitty-gritty.
Sure.
In your 2020 article for the Journal of Singing called Nasality Deconstructed, you say what nasality is does not often coincide to its perceptual characteristics. And equally, studies have demonstrated that there isn't really this general consensus among singing teachers about perceived nasality. So what do we tend to perceive as nasal amongst us? And in your view, what actually is nasality?
Okay, so this is really kind of this is the thing I've been on for years, a decade now, and we're actually ordering a new device so that we can continue this research, because I specifically want to start investigating what nasal airflow does and how much musical theater singers are using it or not using it in the same pitch range where I know tenors are using it when they sing classically. But the perception of the sound, there has yet to be a study where any expert listeners have agreed on this sample sounds nasal, this one does not. When we did that study, we had a whole bunch of singers who had sung on a device called a nasometer, showing acoustic output of acoustic signal of the nose compared to the mouth. That's what that device measures. And there was absolutely, we would play an example that was almost, in fact, one of the examples I had was the lowest nasalance I've ever measured on a singer. It was a bass. And half the professional voice teachers that we had perceptually evaluate that example found that it was nasal. And there's an important reason why. The reason for that is the only consensus that there seems to be on what listeners, expert listeners, because we're voice teachers, we're expert listeners. The only consensus seems to be that what the expert listeners believe is nasal is twang. The bright sound. The sound that we require in our musical theater singing now. The sound that is so prevalent in our, pop styles, rock styles, etc., etc., etc. And I would add, in a way, was present in this classical bass voice, in his voice, because what they were hearing and perceiving as nasal was his singer's format. It was the high spectral energy in the sound. It wasn't as frequency wise high as what we generally think of with our musical theater singers, which tends to be more like 4,000 to 8,000 hertz ish. This gentleman's was like 2.4 hertz to like 3 hertz, 3 kilohertz, like 2,400 to 3,000 hertz. More where we would expect a bass singer's format to be. But it's that high spectral energy that if there's any agreement at all of what nasality, quote unquote, air quotes, sounds like, it is that high spectral energy. And, it's funny, the comparison that we usually make is that for decades, audio engineers who do recording, when they think of low range, mid range, high range, from a mixing standpoint, they talk about the low range being 0 to 5,000 hertz, and the mid range being 5 to 10,000 hertz, and then high range being above 10,000 hertz. For decades, they've talked about the nasal mid range of 5 to 10,000 hertz. And when you boost the mid range of a singer, which we also know is happening in many professional Broadway theaters, they're boosting that frequency range on the mixer. That is giving us more of that perceptual quality of that bright buzziness of twang. Even though the singer, the likelihood, here's the other thing I want to add to this. The likelihood that sound includes nasal airflow and that the soft palate is relaxed is very low. Because what the nasal passage does is it has very thick mucous membranes, it's moist, there's other structures up there, typically hair, etc. And those things dull sound, particularly high spectral energy. Now, there's some research that suggests that a little bit of airflow through the nose seems to actually be a good thing for the singing voice because of what it does in terms of resonance stability. That's a different conversation. I'm just talking about the noise itself now. But from a perceptual standpoint, there is rare agreement that noises that do have more airflow out the nose, there's not been a single study that has shown any agreement that equates, that the lowered velum, the relaxed velum, equates to a nasal sound, because we think of the twang as the nasal sound. And we create that with the pharyngeal narrowing, the covering up of the piriform sinuses, the narrowing of the pharynx with the back tongue wall. That's how those higher frequencies are created. So it's in other words, partially the answer is it's a mess. Partially the answer is the thing that we think sounds nasal has nothing to do with the nose.
Are there particular genres that might enhance a teacher's sensitivity to perceived nasality compared to others? So if somebody is more within the classical realm compared to the CCM realm, or vice versa, are they going to pick up on it more likely than others, or is that not showing up anywhere?
I'm going to give you two answers.
Okay.
I think that it depends. I think a musical theater teacher who taught a lot of CCM styles, something like that, would be more likely to address a lot of the dull noise, the noise, because it would be lacking the high frequency energy that they would be expecting from twang. And I think a classical teacher might be have a greater chance and be more likely to identify twang as we would want in a musical theater singer as nasality, and think that has to do with the soft palate being relaxed, when in actuality, I would argue that if they're hearing that in someone who is trying to create a classical sound in the first place, their singer is singing with a slightly elevated larynx and a slightly shut off pharynx compared to what they want for their classical timbre. So, in other words, I'm not saying one of these is right, one of these is wrong, one of these is, but I think it's more likely that a classical singing teacher would be more likely to address something that they view as over twangy because they're perceiving energy that they want to be the singer's format cluster that's too high in frequency. Again, probably because of an overly narrowed pharynx or an overly raised larynx. And a musical theater teacher would be more likely to address the dull sound, the honk sound, because of the actual velum being overly down and it eliminating the high frequency spectral energy that they need for our more contemporary styles. That would be my two-part answer to that question. Now, I mean, do we have teachers who would, of course, perceptually identify all these wonderfully and adeptly? And of course, there are brilliant humans out there who understand how to actually perceive sound and have structural frameworks and objective frameworks for doing so. But those would be my guesses.
Near the beginning of the year, Heidi Moss posted in a forum to reiterate the message that when positive change is made in a singer's experience, we don't have to run and give it a scientific explanation or a prescription as to why, because after all, it's such a complex system that we can never really be 100% sure that the thing we think is responsible for the change is actually the thing that should be getting all the praise. So if our work is exclusively with perception per se, how do you advise that as teachers we plan and deliver as accurately as possible in the studio?
You mean like in terms of preparing for a lesson?
I think so. I'm just thinking about like when I reflect on and do my notes, I'm thinking, well, that worked positively, so that could be because of this. And next time I'm going to do this exercise and see how that works. Because in my mind, I guess I'm saying, well, things are leading down the path of tongue, or things are leading down the path of this missing register. But I guess then we are sort of being prescriptive in a place where we can't really prescribe or ascribe.
I tend to be so uniquely responsive to each student that, golly, it just depends, right? Like, like, because I have different populations of students, right? So I have students like at the university level who are really like developing a singing technique and singing ability and function and whatever. And then I, of course, got professional singers who do like, drop-in lessons, whatever, come with a specific issue or what have you. And so like, obviously in those drop-in lessons with like my pros, or maybe they've got an audition coming up and they just need to, we're just going to address the moment, right? So there's no way to be, but I guess I think about if it's with my singers in training, my like 18 to 20-year-olds, I tend to solely build my own teaching around voice function. And to me, and just gets into a little bit of my own teaching philosophy in general, if the vocal folds function efficiently and you understand how to emotively and affectively shape a resonator, a vowel, and you understand then how those first two things, the vocal folds and the vowel shape, impact the what the airflow is doing at the vocal folds. Once you set that up for a student, they're so likely to have a sense of ease in their singing. It goes back to like Heidi's first point. They'll respond positively, right? You know, they're going to have this positive body response. And so I try not to, as we're coordinating a voice, go off down too many rabbit holes until I have to. But then of course, I mean, at some point you've got to be, at some point you have to be prescriptive. If as you said, like you brought up the tongue or you're missing a register or something. I mean, at some point, if something's going on, you have to deal with it. I mean, you can't just ignore it forever, because everyone's body's going to respond differently to everything. And so, I mean, now, if I have somebody who's struggling with their tongue, one of my principal rules about teaching, just as if I had someone who was struggling with a vellum issue, I never tell them that. Unless I absolutely have to. Because, like, for example, and I would even present it, let's say we were dealing with the tongue. I would always present it that we are trying to work on new tongue coordinations. Because as soon as you tell a singer they've got tongue tension, they're going to have tongue tension the rest of their life. You know, like forever. Whereas if you just present the idea that we're using glick to coordinate articulations of the tongue, that is a different thing than we're trying to release tongue tension, or we're trying to, free you of this problem that you have. Because as soon as we introduce it as you've got a problem, you are broken, they're forever going to be broken.
I'm just pressing the pause button on the podcast for a very brief moment to invite you to book your free BAST call. If you've been thinking about joining the BAST community through one of our courses, but you just don't know which option is the best for you, then why not book your free Zoom chat with our very own Kimberly George, who has all the answers. Head over to basttraining.com/book-a-call/ and click that big blue button. That's basttraining.com/book-a-call/. Now, where were we?
I guess it's also keeping your mind open to, this could be why, this other thing could also be it. We're not totally sure what the exact answer is, but we're going to go with the one that's giving you the results.
Of course. Always.
Yeah.
Always.
And that's quite nice. It makes you feel like you don't have to know absolutely everything for definite. And that is a nice place to be, actually.
If I may, that is because no one does.
And thank you so much for reminding us.
I know. I am dear friends with some of, in my opinion, the best voice teachers on earth. And I don't know one of them who has all the answers. If you meet one, I'd really like to meet them.
Can you help us define nasalance and what the benefits can be in singing?
Yeah, nasalance is easy to define. Nasalance, there were two definitions in the literature of nasalance. One is based on the acoustic signal. One is based on the airflow. Acoustic nasalance is simply the acoustic output of the nose divided by the acoustic output of the nose plus the acoustic output of the mouth, in a simple ratio. That's any device that is measuring with microphones, like with just pressure transducers, that is determining an amount of nasal acoustic signal that is defined as F1 nasalance, or first format nasalance. That is largely because those microphones on most of those devices that he created had a sensitivity around the frequencies at the first format of all vowels. The second type of nasalance he defined as FO nasalance, or fundamental frequency nasalance, and that is more the airflow percentage of what the airflow ratio is between the nose and the mouth. But that is all that the measurement is. Now, you asked a follow-up, which is, what is Nasalance doing? So studies by Sundberg, Gill, Law have shown that a mild amount, or a moderate amount, slight, you might say, amount of nasal airflow, of velopharyngeal opening, can positively impact the overall resonance stability of a voice, because it tends to give us the high spectral energy of the singer's formant cluster, while a little bit attenuating the first vocal tract resonance, and therefore giving us some more stability as we ascend through Passaggio. This Passaggio, that range. That
and what pitches are they?
Like D4 to G4 range, depending on how you define Passaggio, you might, generally say, but near where the actual sort of mode 1, mode 2 shift would happen naturally in a voice, but also where there's all sorts of resonance interactions occurring. And one of my studies, and one of the first studies on this, Birch et al., which came out of Sundberg's lab, my dissertation and follow-up to that, a study by Echternach's team in Germany, they have all demonstrated that we know at least tenors are doing this. At least in my stuff, at least on open vowels, like on ah. And again, I'm not with a lot of nasal airflow, but with a moderate or slight amount. Seems to be one strategy that could be used to help someone navigate that pitch range, at least on open vowels.
So if you were using that strategy with a singer or doing it yourself, how can we easily switch between a little bit of VPO as we move through the transition, but then let it go so that we can reap the benefits but not cling on?
Yeah. The answer is, that's going to depend on your singer.
Okay.
And here's the full disclosure. I tend to not use this strategy in lessons, personally. And it actually relates back to one of your earlier questions. I've done enough Nasalance readings of myself to know that despite the fact that I don't think I do this, I do this. No matter how robust an operatic sound I'm making, there is a mild amount of velopharyngeal opening happening when I ascend, at least on ah, through that pitch range, as much as I don't want to admit it. And that being said, I tend not to address it directly in my own teaching. I'm not gonna lie. It tends to. I've done it when I feel like the singer is absolutely otherwise stuck, but I've got enough strategies that I tend to not teach it that way.
When we research stuff, how do we decide what's good to bring to the singer's awareness and what's best left?
Oh, I mean, that's like developing skills as a master teacher, right? I mean, like, that's I mean, I don't know how we do it. I mean, I think one of the ways that you do it is, you learn as much as you can. And then one of the things I talk about a lot with my graduate students and my teachers in training, because a lot of my future job is training teachers. My general belief as a teacher is you are going to make mistakes. You are going to tell students stupid things You're going to tell them not the right thing. You're going to, because you are not perfect, just like they're not perfect, just like ain't nobody perfect. And so free yourself from the idea that you're always going to have the way to apply this thing that I've learned to be the right idea for this singer right away. And so what I say to my singers who are teachers in training is you got to get your sea legs. It's just like being on a boat. You're going to throw up the first time. So forgive my reference, but you're going to. And then the next time you're on a boat, you're going to do it less. The next lesson you teach, you're going to say less stupid stuff. The next lesson you teach, you're going to get better at, well, let's maybe stick with this. And this idea seemed to work better. And that's just learning to be a functional singing teacher. No matter how many classes you took, no matter how many books you read, no matter how many studies you've done, no matter how many arias you've sung, no matter how many musical theater roles you've sung, when you start teaching, you will screw stuff up.
It's so refreshing to hear. We need that reminder from time to time, don't we?
And it's okay. Gosh, it's okay. We are not curing cancer. We're helping people express themselves more beautifully as a person by singing more efficiently, which gives a positive mental and physical response. Which is important, which is as important as curing cancer. But in the end, we're not, solving crises in the Middle East. We're helping someone sing Defying Gravity more efficiently.
Yeah. And someone who's come out and actually mentioned the nose is Celine Dion. And she opened up about her vocal challenges coping with stiff person syndrome. And in her interview with NBC, she says that to help, some of the keys of her songs were decreased a little bit. She described a narrower space, and she said that she adopted and projected more nasally. So obviously a lot of us weren't there in the room, but was the nose actually assisting her here, or would you presume that would be a twang approach?
It could be either. If we're talking about lower in her range, if we're talking about something that she was battling in her, Italian word primo passaggio, it could have been that she was giving some nasal airflow. My guess is she was giving a little bit more narrowing as she got higher. That's my guess. Because that also would have already, particularly some narrowing of the pharynx would be kind of core to her sound. And that might give you the perception that even yourself, that you're singing more nasally. That's my guess, particularly since what we know she was dealing with was extreme muscle spasms. And so, again, we can only speculate. I mean, I'm very glad that I watched that interview now that you ask about it. But we are, of course, only speculating because we weren't, in the room with her particularly, because then she also said, if you took note, actually, of what her next comment was, she talked about, and my sound engineers were trying to find my voice, and blah, blah, blah was trying to find. In other words, they were trying to tweak the EQ on the system to find her voice, quote unquote. I think that is as an important observation as what she was doing physically for us as singing teachers is, if you are not familiar with contemporary voice teaching, you have got to realize that what in the end matters is the signal after the signal chain, not the signal that's coming out of your mouth. And, her audio engineer was trying to do as much for her as she was. And as she said, it was a team effort, right? Like, it wasn't just one or the other. I've seen presentations of looking at some of our Broadway singers, just rehearsing, and they don't sound the way they do in the theater. Just like any of our, it's just like anyone. If we're listening to a rock singer sing in a concert in an arena, And then versus the track, I mean, of course it's going to sound different. You know, and I think as we do get more into contemporary styles and that becomes more in our general voice teacher awareness, I actually think it's very critical that we understand what audio processing is doing to a singer's voice. You know, what is a microphone and its EQ, its frequency response doing to a voice? What is the sound engineering then doing to a voice in terms of the compression, you know, and all these different things? I think it's absolutely critical.
Which kind of brings me on, and I think I know the answer to the question because I've read your article, but considering the nature of resonating tubes in chambers and acoustics, and understanding that Nasalance attenuates or diminishes resonance, what side are you on in the nasal resonance debate?
Well, I was pretty clear
Yes.
in my I think the single most controversial sentence that I've ever written, which no one read because, you know, I released Nasality Deconstructed the week the pandemic hit. And so no one read it.
Well, you were waiting for the trolls and the backlash, were you?
And I said something along the lines of, I propose that we eliminate the term nasal resonance altogether. Because the nose, neither, if we think of resonance as a definition of amplification and enrichment, it is neither amplifying sound nor is it enriching sound. Mm-hmm. And so I just went out on a limb and said, we should just get rid of this term altogether. And now third talk I've done on this month. I'm just waiting for someone to like put this in print and someone be like, see, Perna said it. What an idiot. Yeah, but we're not there yet. I guess
we can rally around the troops.
Hey, can't wait.
As a researcher, how do you become invested in following and uncovering a topic, but with the acceptance that later down the line, you might find that it's actually not right and something else has come up to prove you differently?
Well, actually, it is my hope, my personal philosophy of research is actually the hope that that will happen. I say to my students, I got this, let me give credit where credit is due. When Christian Herbst was on Vocal Fry, he said, look, we've all been cleaning up Vandenberg's work for 60 years. That does not discredit Vandenberg's contributions to voice research. What Christian was saying is, we've learned more. One of my dearest friends, Josh Glasner, I think he's actually quoting Ron Shear, but loves the phrase, good science seeks to disprove itself. Staying curious means that you have an awareness that you are probably wrong. I'm probably wrong. And so that keeps instilling a sense of curiosity in myself. And what we should all be doing is, rather than thinking that we are right about anything, one of the problems with voice studies that had happened over decades was that people thought they were right about a thing and then went about trying to prove that they were right about that thing. That is the opposite of how we should go about a line of scientific inquiry. We should go about a line of inquiry of, I think this is right. How do we disprove it? Because good science, a good study, doesn't prove anything. It may disprove that a thing is happening, but science doesn't prove things. That it is like a misconception that I think we have in the singing voice, that like a study will prove us right. It will validate us. No, it won't. It might invalidate what you think, but the likelihood is it's not going to validate what you think. And so I think that I now tell my students, look, you're going to be cleaning up my mess for the next 50 years. At least you better, or all this was for naught. It's my hope that that is exactly what I'm instilling in my students is go prove me wrong. Please. Because I'm an idiot. What do I know? Look, too often, one of the problems in our field is too often we think we know what's happening. And publicly, we were supposed to put on this facade of, well, you should come study voice with me because I know what's happening. Let me tell you what, the more you learn about all this, you understand how complex this instrument is. And do I get good results from my singing students? Yes. Do I have successful singers who study with me? Yes. So I must know something. I actually don't think I'm an idiot. But
you've said it now, Nick, so it's out
well,
there.
hey, whatever. But I've said it 1,000 times on Vocal Fry. But I also recognize that I don't know everything. Not even close, because this instrument is so complicated. Just explaining the airflow dynamics of phonation and how that affects acoustic vibrations within the vocal tract is super complicated. And so to think that like you would just know all the things about it, ooh boy, that's a long con. I mean, So anyway, stay curious, keep doing. Look, all we're doing is doing the work, right? I mean, we're never. This is very much you got to enjoy the journey, not the destination. And if you think you've arrived at the destination, maybe it's time for a different journey or something, And for a while, after I wrote that 2020 article on nasality, I was kind of like, okay, I think I've said the last thing I've said about nasality. And I haven't, and then the pandemic happened and I had to figure out online voice teaching and had to figure out different priorities in life and whatever. But this last actual couple of months of coming back to thinking about nasality has actually kind of reinvigorated me and made me realize that I still have more questions and I still have more things I'd like to pursue with this line of research that I didn't know, and it really helped me putting it away for a number of years. I mean, it's been almost a decade since I really did anything with it, and it's time to open it back up because I'm curious again.
So what's one of the big questions that you have about it that you'd like to explore next?
Straight up, are treble musical theater singers using velopharyngeal opening in the lower half of the treble staff like tenors do or not? When they are singing their open vowels, their ah, their eh, maybe even their ah, the vowels that we think of as good belting vowels, is there any VPO or not? That is, and the hard question that I'd like to ask, and I can explain why. The hard question I'd like to ask is, are they doing it when they belt? Are they doing it when they mix? Or are they doing it something else? Except the hard part about that is, any trained musical theater singer, they mix when it's emotionally appropriate to the song. They belt when it's emotionally appropriate to the song. To ask, we've done a study before, I supervised a doctoral project where we had these Broadway professionals where we asked them to belt a scale, and they were like, I don't know, I don't belt scales. But the way we did it, the way we actually got some interesting things is, as soon as we asked them to sing a phrase of a song that they knew, that elicited belt or mix or legit or whatever, then they gave us interesting data. So that's kind of my next thing. And I personally have never had in my hands ability to one of the nasometers that measures airflow, and so it's one of the devices that we're getting as we continue to reinvent our voice lab at CU Boulder, where I'm about to start in the fall. That's one of my pieces of equipment that I'm purchasing with my startup funds. Because that now that I've been talking about this for the last month, I've just realized like, and I've taught as many musical theater singers over the last decade as I have classical singers. And the question of whether like classical tenors seem to be doing this seems to pretty well be answered. The answer is oftentimes yes. I mean, there have been enough studies at this point that I'm kind of like, whether you think you're doing it or not, you probably are. But I really would like to know, like, is this actually a critical piece to identifying and understanding mix, right? Like, we don't know what that word means, right? Like, everybody tosses it around. We don't know what that word means. But is that literally a thing that musical theater singers are doing in this, like, E4 to B4, C5 pitch range? Where they're, very speaky, or they're mixy, or they're whatever, insert musical theater term you'd like to use there. I don't care. Our vocal fry philosophy is we don't get caught up on terminology. Like, but is VPO a critical part of that pitch range for those singers? I don't know. I don't even want to speculate, but I'd like to know.
And can you leave us with a tip on? I know that this is something that you don't necessarily go to as your first thing, but if we want to explore it ourselves, just to kind of map out what we've spoken about here, what would be your best tip for finding more VPO or actually closing the port?
Yeah, sure. Well, the easiest observation you can obviously make, just to know whether there's anything happening or not, is to simply sustain a tone, pinch your nose shut, and see if you notice any difference to airflow. Is there a pressure change that happens in your ears at all? If there is, there's probably something going on in that sung tone that includes a slightly lowered velum. That is the easiest way to check. That is different than that's how I would use it to, help me do a task. I have observed singers who will play around with different hand postures to their nose, across their nose, covering their mouth, this kind of thing covering the nose, to give them different perceptions of maybe a percentage of airflow. I think those external means are easier than you trying to physically manipulate your soft palate. It's like it's literally like a singer dealing with laryngeal height, right? Like, we don't want to like physically be trying to too much internally manipulate the larynx, right? Because we're probably just gonna end up engaging the tongue in some weird way, or maybe the constrictors of the pharynx in some weird way. It's in the end, it's one of those, we think we're doing a thing that we're probably not doing. And when we're doing a thing, we're probably not aware that we're actually doing that thing. Pointing back to just how complex this instrument actually is.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're heading over to Colorado. Your life is being moved from one point to the next. So what are you heading on over to do there?
Yes, in August, I will begin my time as Associate Professor of Voice and Vocal Pedagogy and Director of Vocal Pedagogy at CU Boulder, which was the position that was Burton Coffin's, the great Burton Coffin's, and that he started, the doctoral program that he began, and then was handed off to Barbara Dosher, the great Barbara Dosher, and then Patty Peterson followed that up, and one of their students. And anyway, I'm super honored and thrilled, and could not be more excited to start, to get there. And we're going to be, over the next 3 to 4 years, we've got some important initiatives that we're going to be looking at, revamping the doctoral program, and probably starting a summer institute of some sort, and building out our voice lab, and doing some different things that we're super excited about. So keep an eye on us.
Yeah, and how can we do that? How can we keep an eye on your work and any future research you do and get in contact with you in future?
Sure. So my personal website is nicholasperna.com. Very simple. NicholasPerna.com. That's my personal website. You can reach me there. You can book lessons there. I will admit I don't have a lot of lesson bookings open currently in July because of the move, but there will be more coming in August. You can also listen to our Vocal Fry podcast, VOCALFRI, which we started. We will be starting our 8th season in the fall, and with my dear friend, former student, now former colleague, and dear friend Sarah. As my co-host, and we're looking forward to actually having some of my now new doctoral students who are working on their own projects joining us on Vocal Fry, talking about some of the research that we've got going on there in the department, etc. And we're excited about some new directions for Vocal Fry. But those are the best ways. You can reach me at my CU email as well, nicholas.perna@colorado.edu. So I'm all over the net. You can follow me on Instagram. I've got a YouTube channel, Nicholas Perna, tenor and teacher. I joked once that I exist more virtually than I do in person. And yeah, just check it out, and would love to connect.
Brilliant. Well, Dr. Nicholas Perna, thank you for keeping me company today. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, Alexa, thank you. This has been wonderful.
Hey you! If you're enjoying the Singing Teachers Talk podcast, then don't forget to hit the subscribe button. We are committed to bringing you engaging conversations and valuable insights from experts across the field of voice. By subscribing, it means we can continue to do that. You'll never miss an episode, and you'll be helping to spread the word to other singing teachers, vocal coaches, and overall voice nerds. So subscribe to this channel now and just watch your teaching grow.